Well, I trust everybody enjoyed their lunch, and I hope you all managed to discover the pudding. It took me a bit of time to find out where it was, but I got there in the end. It's my great pleasure to introduce our second keynote of the day. Samantha Job from the FCDO is the Director of Defence and International Security Policy. And has been doing that job, I think, for just over 3 years, Samantha. And I suspect it's never been a dull moment during that period. There can't be many, I suppose we always say this, but it certainly feels to me like the last 3 years, 3 and a bit years, have been full of really important foreign policy challenges, a significant number of which, though not all of which, have had an important nuclear dimension, which is, of course, of interest to people here. And it's a mark, I think, of the distinction which Samantha has fulfilled that role that she was awarded, as our sign up here suggests, the Companion of the Order of St. Michael and St. George. Have I got that title right? In the New Year's Honours list. So congratulations to her for that. I think you've been working in government in the FCDO since 1992, if I've got that right. So a distinguished career in many parts of the world, many different positions during that period, but now in that really critical positioning in the Foreign Office dealing with defence and international affairs. And we thought rather than having a speech and Q&A, the two of us would have a conversation about a number of different aspects, which I hope will get you guys going in terms of asking questions. I'm going to ask you a few sort of career-oriented questions, since this is an early career event, and then ask you a few things about the integrated review in relation to nuclear aspects, both on the deterrence side and the arms control side. And if that doesn't get this audience going with lots of questions, I'm not sure what will. So maybe I can start by asking, why did you decide to become a diplomat? Was there ever a moment in which you did decide to become a diplomat?
There was. I was 14. So my parents had met in the Air Force. My father did air electronics, and my mum was an air traffic controller. And so I grew up, I was born in Malta, we lived in Hong Kong, we lived in the UK. I grew up with the sense of the world as this sort of interesting place. I've lived in 3 different countries by the time I was 6. And as I got a bit older, I realised military service per se was not for me, but the sort of civilian equivalent to me, that the service part of service was definitely sort of family values and culture that I absorbed. But I also, the idea of diplomacy and trying to keep the world safe from the civilian end of it fascinated me very much. And I've been extremely lucky, I think, because obviously at 14 I had no idea what it meant. It just sounded good, right? But as I went through my studies and then into my career, I was lucky enough to get to be in this career, and secondly, it has panned out to be the thing I wanted it to be. So a lot of people, including most of my family, changed their career several times over the period of time that I've been doing what I've been doing. And one of the things that the Foreign Office offers is a series of different jobs within that career. But it wasn't, I think, a surprise to my family when, a few years into my career, I sort of came back to security policy as a thing I was interested in. So some of my peers who joined the office were sort of, what are these funny Ministry of Defence people? They speak a different language and they wear uniforms, and none of that fazed me at all. To me, that was really interesting. I found out shortly after I started in the Foreign Office, the penny finally dropped. My dad flew Vulcans for a while. And those of you who are experts in our nuclear history will know what used to sit underneath a Vulcan bomber. But I didn't know that as a kid. Well, the penny started dropping later in my career, and I thought security policy to me has always been that crux of making the world safer, but sits within the international aspects of it, is the bit that I do.
Very interesting. So if you were talking to somebody in their early or mid-20s who was thinking about a career in government in general, but I guess in the FCDO in particular, I mean, what hints would you give them? What tips would you give them? Would you say, yes, it's fantastic, it's just as fantastic now as it was when you joined it, or what would you say to them?
I could answer that question with about half an hour of personal reflection, so I'll try and keep it focused. The first is, I absolutely love my job. I get up in the morning and I get to do something that really matters. To me, I am lucky to be able to do that, and it is what drives me in the morning. Secondly, I've, over my career, been able to be at the forefront of essentially crisis response. So 9/11 hit when I was kind of mid-career. I was between jobs and I could pick up the phone and say, what can I do to help? And I was in the crisis centre the next day responding. So since then, I've been responded to hurricanes, I've responded to civil unrest in North Africa. We had to close an embassy and evacuate people. Last year, I was involved in flying British nationals home as part of our pandemic response. And I was on duty in the Foreign Office as sort of gold, as it's known, the night the Russia invaded Ukraine. So I've got a series of things where I can look back and go, yes, I was there. And that was one of the things that inspired me. What tips would I give you? The skills, don't be put off by sort of the reputation that we may or may not have as an organisation. The real skills that we need in the civil service and definitely in the FCDO are people skills. So yes, we need the brightest and the best, who I already know it's a given that you're in this room. But we need people who care about other people who can listen to other people and really understand what motivates somebody else so that you can work out how to get to where you want to go to. So a sense of humour is a really important skill. And just those people skills, those sort of softer skills as much as the intellectual ones.
I love the idea of having the title of Russia Gold.
I wasn't the only one. That's just crisis,
I know.
Crisis terminology. I was gold that night.
Very good. I mean, one of the unique things about an FCDO career, maybe unique compared with any other government department, is you have to travel a lot and spend extended parts of your career elsewhere, or very often you do. And was that something that attracted you, the fact that you would be travelling?
In my case, yes. The career is a life. It's not just a career. That's the difference from home civil service. So home civil service departments, you might do one posting overseas, or you might do two, but we expect to spend half to 2/3 of our career overseas. So that is a decision not only for you, but for your family. Are you going to take your family around the world with you, which is what I do? Are you going to be prepared to change where you live every few years? And if that's something that just fills you with total horror, then this isn't the career for you. But if the idea of going and living somewhere for a few years, somewhere absolutely fascinating, because it's lovely or because it's awful, either way it's always fascinating, with the possibility of continuing sort of fresh challenges every few years, different languages, different cultures, then yes, this is for you.
And I noted that you're on the advisory committee of Women in International Security UK. So tell me a little bit about what that involves, and maybe in particular, say anything you want to say about how you think the position of women in the Foreign Office has changed in the period since you've joined.
When I joined the Foreign Office, I'd been in the office about 6 months. I was working on Middle East peace process, and I went to a conference, a bit like this one. And I sat at a breakfast table. It was one of those sort of long, thin ones at Wilton Park, if anybody, those of you had a chance to go over there. And a senior British ambassador asked me how I was doing. Did I enjoy the job? I said, I absolutely love it. It's exactly what I wanted to do. Bright-eyed, bushy-tailed, 6 months, young graduate. And he looked me in the eye in front of other people and said, it won't last. It's no career for a woman. That was 30 years ago, I hasten to add. He was ambassador to Tunis. In my mid-career, I was head of our North Africa department, and I line managed the ambassador to Tunis. And then I appointed the first female ambassador to Tunis. And it gave me great satisfaction. So, yes, early in my career, I can remember meeting with some businessmen who were coming to ask for advice on whether to invest in the occupied territories, the Palestinian territories. And I was the expert on that, but they sort of walked in the room and looked at me, who does she think she is, kind of thing. And I felt the need to tell them in great detail what I knew for the next 20 minutes to prove to them that I was in fact the person they should be talking to and not anybody else. I don't tend to feel that anymore, partly because I'm kind of older and got more positional power because I'm a bit more senior. But it really, really matters to me that in every room there are women in it. Now, in international diplomacy, there are still more women than there are in international defence. And in the nuclear industry as a whole, it's getting better, but still hard. So did I walk into this room and immediately look around to see what proportion of women there were in the room? Yes, I did. I do it everywhere I go. And cannot help but notice that A, it's changing, and B, it's still not there yet. So one of the things I'm most proud about that I get to do in the civil service, I am the gender champion in the national security community. So I'm the NSC gender champion, and you'll see my name around in that capacity sometimes. And that's because despite 30 years of me and other people championing it, we're not entirely where we want to be. That's because diversity of thought, diversity of approach, diversity of experience makes better policy. The Foreign Office has come a hugely long way. If you were to give me the name of the top ambassadorships around the world, they would probably be Washington, Paris, New York, NATO until last week, Japan, China, Berlin. Those are all women. And that really wasn't the case. And Moscow. And Ukraine, of course, famously at the moment. So all of the big jobs we have proved can be done and can be done well by women. And that won't always be the case. Of course, it shouldn't be 100% one way or 100% the other way. But that was definitely not the case when I joined.
It certainly was not. I remember that as well. So that's really helpful. So what I thought we might do now is turn to the integrated review, which you were very involved with. It seems an age ago, but it's not much more than a year ago that the UK has a habit of spending many, many years preparing to publish a multi-year review, and then inevitably, a year later after it's published, then all the think tankers and parliamentary committees come out and say, oh, it's all out of date, we've got to have another one. So, I mean, that's just the nature of the business. And of course, others say, well, actually, it's been proven more or less right. We can perhaps discuss that when in this discussion. But I wanted to focus in to start with on the nuclear element, because I think it's 3 pages out of about 115, 120 pages in the integrated review as a whole. But it's actually quite significant, and there's a whole separate review process around nuclear to come to that conclusion. And certainly my reflection on it is that compared with the previous published review in 2015, it marked really some quite significant changes in direction in terms of greater emphasis on the deterrent aspect, less transparency, that announcement about a higher warhead ceiling, and so on. So I guess my first question is, from your point of view, is that perception right? Did the 2021 nuclear review mark a significant change in direction, and if so, why?
It did reflect, I'm going to argue back on your 3 pages actually, by the way. It did reflect a huge amount of careful thought. So the IR process started in 2019, 2020, before it was called the IR. It was going to be another SDSR.
Yeah.
And we did lots of analysis of threats to the UK. What are the threat vectors? Where are they coming from? What's changing in the world, as you would expect, with some incredibly deep thinking and skilled analysts. And we red teamed it with all sorts of people. And we had a draft pretty much ready to go in December 2019. And I know this because I sat in a room in Whitehall with some other very senior, important thinkers from around the place. And we said to ourselves, are there any black swan events that we haven't put on this list that we should have done? And yes, somebody said a pandemic. And 2 weeks later, we were in a pandemic and the whole thing had to go on ice. So post-pandemic, we got it out again. And we had a look at it and said, actually, the analysis is still true. It's just one thing has changed in the sense of health security. But what the pandemic had illustrated was a lot of the strands in the integrated review that you will have, I hope, read at some point around state threats, around technology, around sort of what's now known as supply chains, but it's sort of strategic goods, if you like, the sort of dependencies. They were all the same. They had just been dialed up a bit and frankly come a little bit more out into the open as a result of what happened during the pandemic and how different countries handled it. And then, so we did all of that. And then this time last year, I was doing lots of think tank events, talking about the integration review, including the aspects that I will get to. And then, you know, this Russia-Ukraine hit. And what was really interesting about Russia-Ukraine was lots of people who said, oh, the world must have changed. And then they went back and read it again and went, oh, actually, we said the greatest threat to the UK and European security was Russia. We said the UK was committed to the security of the Euro-Atlantic area as its primary security commitment, even if we weren't in the EU. And look at what we've done. We have absolutely demonstrated that. So it's been really sort of reassuring for those of us who are involved in it that it didn't completely sort of fall flat within a year. The nuclear aspects of it were worked in the nuclear policy community at great length and in great detail. And we wanted to ask ourselves, as a result of that threat, and it was an increased state threat rather than non-state, which is one of the big changes from the previous SDSR. And if you look at what's happening, particularly on the nuclear strand, what Russia is doing with novel technologies and what China is doing, frankly, with mass, as well as with novel technologies, rearming at a scale that's not happened since the Cold War arms race, is absolutely sort of bonkers, the level at which they're doing. So how are we going to respond to that as an environment? And it throws up a series of deterrence questions about what if there are two near-peer adversaries out there and you're the US, how do you do deterrence in that scenario? What about novel technologies which aren't captured under any of the pre-existing sort of strategic arms control treaties, and you've got a partner in Russia that's basically cheating or ripping them up at a rate of knots? And how do you respond to these different scenarios? So one of the things, the reason I'm going to pick you up on the 3 pages is in the integrated review, one of the changes from 2015 is actually a much stronger arms control and counter-proliferation section. Because if you're a UK policymaker, there is no tension between having a reliable, capable, renewed, strong nuclear deterrent and believing, ultimately, in counter-proliferation to make sure not everybody gets them, but also the ultimate arms control and disarmament agenda that you want to get to in the future. The world is not in a place where we can do that right now, but there are things we can do to prepare for it. I'm sure Bonnie talked about them this morning. So the overall strategic policy, UK will be a nuclear power. If we're going to do it, we're going to do it properly. We will be a minimum credible deterrent. So lots and lots of very clever brains sat down and worked out what they thought minimum credible deterrent was in the scenario that we found ourselves in. And the sort of sad conclusion of that was that we might need up to the given figure of a few more warheads. And that because of the increased threat, a little bit more ambiguity, a little bit less transparency, a little bit more ambiguity to make the other guy think they can't plan absolutely to the number of exactly what we've told them already if they're doing their planning against us, was another move that we made. And the third move that we made was in the context of talking about how there might be future technologies that could amount to a threat that could amount to the threshold that could pose a threat of the sort of a nuclear weapon. So in the past we've talked about CBW, but this time we talked about other technologies of comparable effect. And so that one was a little bit buried, but that again, it's not because we think there's anything out there. It's not because we think there's a sort of a cyber attack would constitute a nuclear attack, although we can get into that a bit more in the Q&A. Yeah. But it was just to reflect the situation we find ourselves in. What it doesn't do is change that fundamental principle of minimum credible deterrence, only got one system, smallest of the P5, all of that stuff. But if we're going to do it, we need to make sure it can absolutely do the thing that we need it for. Does that answer your question?
It does, yes.
Might not answer all of their questions.
But I will ask a couple of supplementaries and then I'll throw it open. So one of the things you said early on is the growing importance of China, described as a systemic competitor in the IR and in many ways a long-term, the most significant threat, something that came out very clearly in Bonnie Jenkins' presentation earlier, by the way, but from an American perspective. But I wasn't sure whether you were saying that longer-term Chinese threat, including the Chinese nuclear buildup, is beginning to be a driver also of UK deterrent policy. Because up to now, really from the beginning of the UK nuclear program, it has all been about the Soviet Union and then Russia. Is it beginning to change, or is that something we should look to future reviews to look at?
It's one of the things policymakers have to think about. There are some very big deterrence questions that policymakers have to grapple with. And as Malcolm knows, when we think about deterrence, we talk a lot to the US. So sometimes we're flushing out issues that we want them to think about as well as issues that we want to think about.
Yeah.
And another country trying to reach, depending how you measure it, but trying to reach parity with the States is a challenge for the States to think about how do they deter to. So one of the big deterrence sort of policy philosophical questions is, can you deter to? How do you deter to? What are the consequences of deterring to? For the UK, we've always been a separate point of decision making, but when you think about deterrence policy, can you conceive of a world in which you would be doing it on your own without your friends? You know, when we talk about Russia, even now, and China the same, we say one of the things we have in our favour is we've got people on our side. We've got the NATO alliance, but we've also got others. So the next question flowing from are you deterring one or two, and how would you do it if you had to, is are you doing it alone or are you doing it with your friends, and what consequences might that have? The next big deterrence question is looking at the capabilities of those two states and what they're developing. There's been seen in the media a lot of talk about might there be battlefield nuclear use. How do you deter that? And how do you respond to that? It's a very different thing from the sort of traditional conceptual stuff. And then the third is, I said I'd come back to sub-threshold. I'm going to do my integrated deterrence 30 seconds now, which is, in the past it has been really easy to distinguish between a sub-threshold activity, a conventional activity, and a nuclear one. So you could do your deterrence differently. I don't think that's true anymore. The sub-threshold to conventional has been blurred by Russia's use of kind of little green men in Ukraine in 2014, or potentially Wagner or other military operating as conventional military but pretending they're sub-threshold. There's a blur. I'm not saying it's completely gone, but there's a sort of how do you think about it? And then between, for me, between conventional and classic nuclear, this question about battlefield nuclear, what does that mean in that sense? And then the point I want to make about novel technologies is there are technologies at the moment which can get you from sub-threshold, but can threaten your nuclear command chain, whether that's space or cyber or some other clever whizzy way of doing it. And then you've gone from sub-threshold straight up to nuclear without passing through conventional. And so how do you deal with that conceptually as new technologies come online that have ways to threaten or potentially undermine your nuclear deterrent? Have we really thought through what that means and how we might do it?
And we're having to think through those things real time in the context of the war in Ukraine, where we're not direct participants, but we are very much participants in a very active way in our military.
And one very final one, if I may, in terms of international context that's changing around us. The real time, at the same time, we have the most activist and focused lobbying against nuclear weapons per se that we have seen since CND in the 80s when you and I were a lot younger. The fact that the TPNW is now in force and is mostly pointed at democracies, they don't really think they're going to make any impact on Russia or China, is something which we as democracies and our democratic allies around NATO and elsewhere are having to deal with in domestic politics, as well as the sort of how do they do their deterrence when they've got political pressure, domestic political pressure, at the same time in a different way. So that was going to be my other kind of what's going on in the world right now question.
And then we've got the NPT review conference.
And then we've got the NPT review conference. I can't wait. I've been waiting 2 years for this.
So will you be leading our delegation there?
We'll have a minister lead the delegation.
Minister, yes.
But I will be there, certainly for the first week.
Excellent, excellent. I think, I could keep asking you questions because I'm absolutely fascinated with your answers, but I think I should, in all fairness, open it up to the audience. So who would like to indicate? Please, would you like to?
What is the point of view of AUKUS, considering the geopolitical situation in the Indo-Pacific and the way China is viewing it as next? There are even many US officials who have termed it in the previous parliamentary conference as the next NATO-like alliance. So how do you think that?
I have have a list of things that have happened while I've been in this job, what I've spent my time on over the last 3 years. The first was the NATO leaders meeting in London. The second was COVID. And the third was AUKUS. I spent all of last summer in darkened rooms with people working out what was going to happen. The National Security Advisor has a great line on this. He talks about it as the most significant geostrategic grouping of countries taking a big decision in 40 years or something. I don't think there's any doubt about its importance in the specific context of a capability that will be introduced to Australia, through Australia, into that region. What it speaks to, the readiness of the US and the UK to have that conversation with anyone who isn't the US and the UK is massively significant for those of you who've tracked this over a period of time. That reflects our perception of what is going on in the Indo-Pacific. And it is one thing that, one lever in the toolbox, if you like. It's not the only one, and it's sort of necessary but not sufficient in terms of managing the security context in the region. What it's not intended to do is kind of destabilize the region or be a kind of anti-China coalition, which it's been talked about in some circles. It's very much not that. It's a capability development approach. And it speaks to what I said earlier about allies working together, friends and allies working together where we can to develop capabilities, to develop ways of thinking, to develop actions in the region. So it is part of, it flows from, guess what, the integrated review, the Indo-Pacific tilt our government wants to make in response to the rise of populations and economies and technology in the Indo-Pacific. But in this specific way, that's sort of one of the defence pillars of that part of that response.
And it's an interesting industrial opportunity for UK.
Hope so.
The UK nuclear enterprise as well.
Yes.
Right,
Right,
let's see now. There are two hands here. I can't see who it is, but if you just stand up and introduce yourself in the middle. Yes, please. Yeah, hi.
You started talking about the absence of tension between the disarmament and the deterrence community in policy making here, and then you ended up with the strength of those that would drive us to zero faster at the end. Is that because you only see that sort of externally in a global sense? Do you see there's been some fundamental shift here as a result of what's happened geopolitically over some time and then in sharp relief recently? Or actually is that tension still there? And
in the UK, you mean?
In the UK domestically and impacting our policy going forward?
That's always going to be a question for the politicians of the day. So this set of politicians, this Prime Minister, had as new Prime Ministers tend to do, a session with experts in this field and Ministry of Defence and, my boss and various others to sit him down and, you're now the Prime Minister of a nuclear power. This is how it works. This is what we do. This is what we're doing with it. This is what's going on. And he asked lots of questions, as politicians tend to do. And at the end of it, he said, right, okay, if we're going to do this, this is who we are. This is what we're going to do. We're going to be confident about it. We're not going to apologise for it. Otherwise, what's the point? You can't do deterrence if nobody believes you'd use it. And so under this government, absolutely, there is no tension because it comes right down from the top. If we were to walk down the street outside and ask everybody what they thought of nuclear weapons, I'm sure we will get a range of views. That's not what I'm suggesting. What I'm suggesting is that at the moment, within the policy review that led to the IR, there was a group of people who worked very closely on it and on these issues, are very integrated. Ministry of Defence and my team, very integrated, and across both the deterrence bit and the arms control bit. So I'm literally getting on. You'll see me leave swiftly in 15 minutes. I'm going to Paris for a P3 discussion, which is the pre-RevCon discussion. And I'm taking with me Ministry of Defence DNO colleagues. And that's just how we do it. And we always do it like that. So not every government is like that. In some governments, there is sort of two versions of, there are two directors like I am, and one of them does the deterrence bit and one of them does the arms control bit, and they have massive rows in the office. In our system, it's sort of, we work that through in a much, much more integrated way.
And of course, in some allied countries, different political parties head
Yes.
the two respective ministries you're talking about,
Yes.
which isn't the case here.
We have had some quite interesting conversations with Germany and Norway, as you can imagine, on this topic.
I think we have another one here.
Yep. I'll try and keep my answers short, and then I will get to everybody, otherwise I'll talk too much.
Thank you. I'm going to just bring a civil nuclear twist to this, because it's not been discussed really much. And also, I want to write a paper on this, so I'd really value your opinion. Climate change is a massive threat to humanity, so we clearly need to be doing more in this space, not just domestically, but also internationally promoting the use of peaceful use of nuclear technology and nuclear material. But I think there's strategic importance to doing that. So my question to you is, what is the role of UK and the West in promoting the use of nuclear power for energy generation, given that China and Russia have dominated this market? Rosatom has 70% of the nuclear export market with their build, own, operate model. They're increasing influence, increasing soft power across the world, and the West are not doing a lot in this space. So what, if anything, should be the UK's role and the West's role in sort of countering the actions of Russia and China in this space, investing in nuclear infrastructure around the world? Should we be doing more? How should we do it? How should we go about it?
Yes. AMRs and SMRs, nuclear standards and safety. If we are, in the Foreign Office, we look at energy security, economic security, and hard security as a continuum, because we're looking at the strategic picture. We're trying to wean people off Russian dependence on Russian oil and gas. How much more dependent are they if it's a nuclear power plant? In terms of strategic dependencies. And length of that is much, much harder to. So absolutely, we need to be out there, we need to be competing, we need to be doing something about it. I think probably, for me, AMR and SMR is the thing where we need to be in the market, we need to be ahead of it. And we're not yet, but we're working on it. I would say in the US as well as UK, companies are doing that. So do we see the strategic picture you just described? Absolutely. Have we got there quickly enough? Probably not. Are we trying to do something about it? Yes. That's the short version, because I promised I would be short.
Short and very clear. Right, who else have we got? I think we've got a couple here, so please.
Thank you very much for your very insightful comments. So you have raised the ban treaty and how it's also primarily targeting or pressuring democracies, which I agree. But I'm wondering how the UK is trying to basically, independent of the ban treaty, but in view of humanitarian concerns and gender analysis, and you describing yourself also as a sort of champion for women, how this can be better incorporated into the deterrence thinking in the way we use concepts and deterrence theory, and how this can even potentially strengthen and make it safer the way we want to posture, the way UK is posturing itself, but also NATO as an alliance, and whether you think this can have more added value, gender analysis, and centering humanitarian concerns a bit more in the cost-benefit analysis, and thereby sort of owning also a bit more the conversation about humanitarian concerns and not making it all about banning nuclear weapons and stigmatizing democracies.
Yeah, I agree with that. The next Humanitarian Conference is just before the TPNW Conference of States Parties, and because it's being tied so closely together, we're actually not feeling able to go to the humanitarian event. We went to the last one. We want to be in that conversation, and we want to be having it in a sensible kind of way. Probably, I can't imagine a time in history when the Ministry of Defence Director General for Nuclear was a woman, the Ministry of Defence Director for Nuclear Policy was a woman, the Foreign Office Director General, Director, Deputy Director, and the whole of the nuclear policy team on the counter-proliferation side are women. It's changing, and that's without even going into bays. So from a sort of diversity of thought going into the policy and just thinking differently, that's got to help. The humanitarian element of it is something we think about when we're looking at the counter-proliferation and arms control angle of the fundamental flaw in the TPNW is, well, there are many, but the fundamental one that we see is that it doesn't think through how it would be done in a practical way, what the consequences, like how could you actually get there? So a lot of the work that we do through the NPT, through the various different initiatives that we're involved in, and not everybody wants us involved in, but we're involved in all the ones we can be, is thinking through things like verification, thinking through how you would actually dismantle and how would you make sure, and that so in those aspects of it, when you're thinking through what would this world look like, what are the indicators we're looking for where we could actually get to disarmament, and how would we do it properly, those I think it's very helpful for. And the other strand of this is talking to all of the communities who do take it seriously, not the ones who are just bashing us over the head and aren't really there to listen. We've had, I think, 2 different delegations to the Vatican to have long conversations with them on exactly this. We talk to all the different parties in the world who have different views. Obviously, we talk to Austria and Ireland, but we also talk to Mexico. And, we try to have all of these conversations so people can understand. I think you're probably right that there's still more that we can do. But we want to be able to do it from a kind of sympathetic but realistic way of doing it. And it breaks my heart to say, the idealistic way won't work. That doesn't mean I don't want people to have those ideals. I absolutely do, and they should be holding us to these standards, and we should be driving for that world. But at the moment, we also have to plan for and live in this one. So how do we make the connections?
So you mentioned in your talk that kind of now at your stage in your career, your kind of position perhaps sometimes negates some of the prejudice that you might previously have received. And although things are getting better, kind of what kind of advice to females at their early and mid-career in building resilience against some of the behaviour that perhaps you may still experience, so that our work and our analysis gets valued, not just our gender?
Quite right. My tips are, 1, don't apologise for yourself. How many times do we say, I'm very sorry, but? Could I just take the floor, please? Is it okay if I say? Yes, it is okay if you say it. That's the first one. And written work, it's the same. The second one is get a buddy. So if you're going into a meeting, for instance, who else in the room will amplify your voice if you're worried the men are going to talk over you or claim your idea as theirs, or all those cliched sort of things? Now, that doesn't have to be another woman by any means, but who else is in the room that you're going to make a pact before you go in, that you're going to you don't even have to agree with the other person's, but you're going to draw attention to it to make sure it's landed. That was a really interesting idea that we heard from over there. I'm not sure what I think about it, but that's really good. We should think about it some more. And while I've got the floor, can I give you my brilliant idea? Just little behavioural things can give you a little bit more confidence for next time. Like obvious things. Take a bloody chair at the table, excuse my language, because so often we don't. And then reflect back. And kind of reflecting afterwards can be really helpful. So if you're absolutely terrified about doing something, I had to brief journalists before the leaders' meeting. And I had to do it on behalf of the Ministry of Defence, the Cabinet Office, and the Foreign Office. I've been in my job 6 months. And these were the names that were going to be on the telly. Like, they were significant names. And I prepped like mad. And I got some press people to kind of red team me, ask me all the hard questions you think journalists might ask. So I got some, and I looked really uncomfortable while I was answering in rehearsal. So preparatory is definitely one of them. And then I went in, and I was holding my water like this for the first few minutes. But I got a couple of my team to sit at the back, and they said, a few minutes in, you relaxed, Samantha, because it was like you realised that you did actually know a bit more than they did, and you were going to be able to handle it okay. And so I came out going, did I survive? And they said, yeah, that's fine, you were fine. And the fact that I hadn't looked, even though they knew I was nervous, I hadn't looked completely terrified, made me think, maybe I can do this. So next time, I just a little bit more confident, still knew I need to do my preparation and my homework, but each time you kind of build your confidence into the next. I guess that's another answer I could give for days, but I hope those are some sort of quick tips that will help.
Very helpful, thank you. Right, gentleman here, yeah.
Hi. A question regarding nuclear ambiguity, which you've mentioned as part of the integrated review. Can you shed more light on how the government came to that stance as its final? So, for example, there's a case to be made for the problematic nature of nuclear ambiguity. If you look at Russian nuclear stance, it is ambiguous enough that the European Union countries and the NATO countries, they were very hesitant at first, for the first few weeks, to actually provide Ukraine with any material support in terms of equipment or finances or anything like that. So what if Is there a case to be made for the UK to have a more specified approach to it? Thank you.
There are pros and cons, of course, and you have to reach a balance. I had a hilarious conversation with my Chinese opposite number shortly after the IR came out. We had our annual counter-proliferation dialogue. And he said, "You're being less transparent. You're being more Chinese, Samantha." And I said, "When you get to the levels of transparency that we have, we'll talk." The point being, we may have taken a little step towards ambiguity, but the amount of information that we have already said, the amount that we publish our doctrine, we've done it again for the review conference, we do it in the IR, we do it every few years. The sort of tweak that we've made doesn't mean that we're going into that sort of shady space where we're not going to tell you anything. It just makes it a little bit more complicated for them to plan against. And that's the sort of logic behind it. It's also why we won't say specifically under what the circumstances are that we would, the no first use thing doesn't work for the UK, because we're a smaller and only have one system type nuclear power. So each country will obviously make their own decisions about that. One thing it is just worth mentioning in case not everyone knows about it, when I talked about going to Paris later for a P3 conversation, in the NPT context, there is what's called the P5 process, where P5 nuclear folk, including military, or defence at least, sit in a room and argue about doctrine. Like, when you say this in your doctrine, what do you mean? And we publish a glossary, which is like definitions of term. Like, what do you mean by this and what do you mean by that? One of the most interesting things about that glossary is the words that aren't in it. Because they're the ones where we've sat down and had a really tough conversation, actually haven't agreed the definition of whatever it is. So those conversations behind the scenes are, for us, part of actually strategic risk reduction. Because as we understand, so if I say this, you're going to understand I've meant that. That is incredibly helpful for deterrence communication. So you know what to say and what not to say. So the early days in the conflict, we had nuclear signalling, shall we say, from Moscow, and various people in Whitehall running around with their hair on fire going, they just said the word nuclear. And nuclear experts saying, well, yeah, that's sort of what we'd expect them to say at this point. It's within the parameters of what we understand about their doctrine, because we're the experts on their doctrine, and it doesn't necessarily mean they're going to do anything. Shall we have a look and see if they're doing anything? They're not doing anything. No, it's just noise. It's fine. But that's the loop we had to go through. And then we had to go through a loop with government officials and ministers and communication folk across Whitehall and say, you know what, here's a set of terms you probably shouldn't use in your desire to be super strong on Russia. Please don't say, And so we think very, very carefully about the language you use and the levels of ambiguity as we go, including in live situations.
And we're very glad that ministers have always kept to those guidelines. So please.
Mostly they did.
Mostly, yeah.
Mostly they did.
David,
we do one at the front first, and then the back. I'll maybe take a couple.
I will have to go.
And then we'll have to wind up.
Thank you. I was going to ask you a question about the fact that in the New Year's Honours list, Commander James Bond also received his C.
It's right above me in the list.
Oh, right. Okay. Did you get to stand next to him in the lineup then?
Sadly, no.
Oh, no. Oh, anyway, I wasn't going to ask you that because it's a bit trivial. But more seriously, how did the FCO perceive the reaction to the integrated review? Was there one?
I don't quite understand the question, so I'm going to say, who do you mean by the reaction? So it depends who we were talking to. The Swedish foreign minister wasn't entirely delighted. The Chinese were kind of, robust in response, as you might expect. When we had our last P5 get-together, or maybe the one before that, Russians and Chinese, loads of questions about what do we mean and what does this and what was that. So it was very much segmented depending on what you were interested in. So the arms control community, very interested in our counter-proliferation pages, gave us a hard time about the warhead cap. That's absolutely what I would expect, and be disappointed if they didn't. The deterrence community was rather like this one going, oh, that's interesting. What do these tweaks mean? Like, what lies behind it? So there's not a straight answer to that, I suppose. For most people, it was, I think probably Heather Williams' article was the one that stayed with me longest, where she went through this whole analysis of why we'd done what we'd done, and was it good or was it bad? And at the end she said, well, if the UK is that worried about the international security situation that they've done this, like, how bad is it? So the one thing it did was make people think. And we were confident about why we had done what we had done. And we had tended to have conversations with people that said, we think the strategic picture is greater state threats, more Russia, more China, more novel technologies, So we think we need to do this. And they were with us all the way to here, but they sort of didn't want us to respond to it. So we're going to have to do something to respond to it. So I think that might even be an easier conversation now.
Hi. I wanted to ask about this sort of additional caveat about new tech to the negative security assurance. Yeah. So I'm not really clear whether you had specific technologies in mind. Elsewhere in the integrated review, there's the assurance that the UK wouldn't use nuclear weapons unless the survival of our state or allied states was under threat. And it seems to suggest that you imagine there are new technologies that might achieve that level of threat. I mean, you said today they could interrupt the chain of command, but you know, in the final analysis, my understanding is deterrence rests on the letters of last resort. I struggle to imagine a new technology affecting them. So obviously you might be limited in what you can say, but I just want to push back on that a little bit and understand if there are particular technologies that were factored into the decision making then, or you're spitballing, or what's going on?
We didn't spitball. Okay. We spent a long time poring over every single word on those pages. What we're talking about, though, is the integrated review is a 10-year outlook. And as the sort of first chapter tells you, the security and science and technology chapter sets out, the one thing that we know is technology is changing, and it's changing really bloody fast. We don't necessarily know what that picture is going to be in 10 years' time. We know that it's changing, we know that it's evolving, we know that it's moving in some cases sort of exponentially, but we can't, sitting here today, actually predict all of it. So I wouldn't call it spitballing, it's a little more hedging. Hedging in the sense of there's a future here that we can't quite see. We want to put a marker down that should that future go in this direction, then we would reserve the right under very, very certain circumstances to think of it in that way. Is there any technology which I can currently look at that I think could have the same impact as a nuclear weapon? No. But keep asking me that question, and then we'll have the conversation. So that's all it was.
Great questions, fantastic answers. Not enough time. It's been a pleasure having this conversation with you, Samantha. And thank you so much for coming to talk to us today. And good luck in your consultations in Paris. And good luck with the transport.
Yeah, exactly. I'm now going very promptly so I can get to some progress. Thank you very much. You've been really interesting. Good luck in your careers. I hope I will see all of you out in the nuclear world in the next few years. Thanks
Thank you.